You know, Dave Chapell has done more for my family than anyone in ensuring that presenters will actually pronounce my last name correctly. For years and years, it was Chapell, but now at least we're close. Chapell. So thank you very much. I met a couple of you last night at the dinner. In case you don't remember, I was the dude walking around with the ukulele. So a couple of things about me. I know a few of you, but just to give you a little background on me. I mean, my first job my first real job out of college was at a small direct marketing firm in Stamford, Connecticut. And we were doing a project for a very large bank. And the bank sent us on magnetic tape a list of all of their best customers. Name, address, telephone number, social security number, bank account number, bank balance. And you think about like why there was so much identity theft going on over the last 2 decades. And it's like, well, there's no encryption to this magnetic tape. There was no password. As a matter of fact, I'll bet you a cup of coffee that it's still sitting in the basement of that direct marketing firm where anybody there who can figure out how to use magnetic tape could use that information. And I thought to myself, there's something wrong here. And so I fast forward a couple of years. I spent about 6 months living in India and came back to New York City, went to law school, grew up, and started at a firm called Jupiter Research, where I spent about 5 years there. And got out of law school in December of 2000, which many of you may remember as the exact moment that Internet 1.0 would officially burn to the ground. So I treaded water for a couple of years and ended up at DoubleClick, where I came across my second kind of privacy moment. Because DoubleClick, now I was not there during the privacy kerfluffle, but I did see the impact of that privacy kerfluffle in the way that DoubleClick's strategy operated. They were clearly very heavily impacted by what happened to DoubleClick as a result of their privacy, we'll just say, issue. And then I spent about 2 years in the email marketing space, and at Cheetah Mail and then Yes Mail. And many of you may remember in 2003, there was a heck of a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt around a California email law, which would have required you, if you were in the email space, to ask consumers permission prior to sending them an email, almost like a European approach. And there was a heck of a lot of wrangling on public policy fronts, and we ended up ultimately with canned spam. But I thought to myself, okay, this is 3 very clear signs. There's something going on here. And so I put out my shingle as a privacy attorney, actually initially as a canned spam attorney, and realized very quickly that the email issue was a very small microcosm of a much larger issue that impacts everybody in this room in a way that I think is only going to increase. So I thought I would start with, because I get asked this question a lot, like what's actually driving the public policy things going on, particularly in DC and to a lesser extent at the States and certainly in Europe. And here's the presumption here. It is generally understood that every single person in this room is a horrible, horrible person, and therefore consumers need to be protected from you. And I'm only half kidding here. And so if a number of the policymakers have their way, this will be the online experience. Okay, you visit the New York Times. But wait, okay, wait, tracking. Wait, I'm not sure I understand what tracking is, but yeah, what the heck, all right. Well, wait, and anyway, so what I'm trying to go through here, and probably this didn't go over as well as it did with my daughter yesterday, but the thing I'm trying to drive through here is that from a public policy front, there are elements in the Privacy Advocacy Committee, and even as high as in the FTC, that genuinely believe that consumers need to be protected from you with disclosures that are arguably just as confusing as they are creating as much harm as they are help. So, but we'll get down to the meat of the presentation. The first thing I wanted to chat a little bit about is just there's sort of a misnomer in online, because I hear this all the time from folks in this room where they say, online is held to a higher standard than offline, right? Everybody says, look at those bastards in offline direct marketing. Look what they've been doing for the last 30 years. Why are you worrying about me? And it's sort of true that online is held to a higher standard, but it isn't just online. The concern is not online in general. The concern is that intermediaries, independent third parties taking independent ownership of data to create their audiences. That's the concern, and that's what's driving a lot of the privacy rules going all the way back to DoubleClick Abacus about 10 years ago. And here, I thought I'd give you a quick example. When you think of a traditional old-school ad network, the DoubleClick ad network, or Dakota, and you had the network sitting in between the advertiser and the publisher, and you think about who has the data in this scenario, it's generally the network. Whoops, there were a number of rules set here to prevent that ad network from invading consumer privacy, depending on how one defines that. One of the things is that you are not supposed to be intermingling personally identifiable information with online or digital profiling information. And that has sort of been a cornerstone rule for just about anybody in the online behavioral advertising space, really, for the last decade. But conversely, if you look at the email marketing space, and here you've got the advertiser who actually owns all the data, the Chapells of the world, and I used to work there, I'm not picking on them, but they are the proverbial dumb pipe, and they're not taking any independent ownership of that data. And if you think about how the Chapell model works, on the one hand, they've got email address, name, typically maybe even telephone number if not directly in the Chapell database, and a linked back-end CRM database. And then on the other side of the equation, they've got all of this online surfing data, particularly if they tie into an analytics program. And so kind of the holy grail that the ad networks are not allowed well, the Maginot line that the ad networks are not allowed to cross, the email marketing folks have been able to cross pretty freely for the last decade. It's a very different rule set. And this is important because as we move into the demand-side platforms, the model is starting to blur a little bit. It's not necessarily just an ad network model. Here, the advertiser technically owns a large swath of the data. The DSP has some of it. But here it's the advertiser. And so query whether or not the rule set is or should be a little bit different given this model. And then you look at the data management platforms. Oops. You look at the data management platforms, and here the advertiser is literally sitting on all kinds of data, and for some reason that's not rendering, but search, social, everything, and all this information is being held by the advertiser. Again, query whether or not the traditional rule set that was created about 10 years ago, primarily for ad networks, still holds under this model. And so we're seeing, this is what we're talking about when you say about the tension. The rule set that the industry has created over the last decade or so is starting to come apart a little bit. Primarily as the industry moves from an audience creation, a la ad network, creating an audience, collecting an audience in point A, and utilizing that on point B. We're moving from an audience creation model to an advertiser enablement model with the DSPs and the DMPs and a lot of the SEM business is essentially an advertiser enablement model, although some of you are trying to get into the audience creation model, and that may be problematic for reasons we're going to discuss in a little bit. There is still a large, and I guess the last panel beat the hell out of Google, right? A little bit? Yeah, everybody does that. I'm not here to beat up on them. I'm just here to observe that the traditional tension between first parties and third parties is becoming exacerbated as Google will claim that they are a first party for just about anything. Facebook's like button, even if you're not logged into Facebook at that point, or at least even if you haven't visited Facebook that week, will make the claim that the like button has the right to collect data as if Facebook were a first party there. I'm not here to say that's right or that's wrong, but I am here to say that that's a very different concept than one we're used to. So what does that mean for folks here? It's a real question of who owns the data. And I'm just giving a couple of different examples here. Does the search engine own search intent data? Or does the search engine marketer own that data? Or does the advertiser own that data? Now, for just about the last decade, it's sort of been all three and none, right? And so everybody's sort of operated under the as long as nobody says otherwise, or maybe better put, as long as nobody catches us, then everybody owns that data, and sort of kind of gone along on that track. When you think about Facebook or the social networking platforms, does Facebook own the data that's being collected there? Does an app that you work with own that data? Or does some other third party that the app happens to be partnering with? Now, Facebook has a very clear answer there, and if you check out their developer terms and conditions, they are doing everything they can do to throw the third-party ad network types under the bus here and say, you know what, under the guise of protecting privacy, we don't think that the third party should be allowed to utilize this data. Again, I'm not here to say it's right or wrong, but I am here to say that the privacy issue in this case is as much a red herring as anything else. They're trying to create, they are trying to protect their closed-loop network. In a mobile context, who owns that data? Is it the mobile operating system, the app, or the third party? It's a similar situation to Facebook. The challenge in mobile, and we may talk a little bit about this later, but one of the challenges in mobile is that there's really almost no way to effectively enable some of the admittedly poor privacy tools that we've set up online work even worse in mobile, and so that kind of complicates things a little bit. So I thought I'd try to keep this fairly practical for folks in this room. And so here's just a couple of things that I've observed out in the marketplace and thought they might be helpful for folks in this room. So there are these building block concepts in privacy that were created in the 70s. And I won't go too far into them, but they're called the Fair Information Privacy Practices. I'm going to go primarily into the first two because from our perspective, they are the most important. The first one is notice. There's a concept that a consumer, someone who you are collecting data on, has a right to understand that you are collecting data, understand what data they're collecting, under what circumstances, how it's going to be transferred to third parties. Now, traditionally, in an online environment, the only mechanism we've offered to provide notice has been the privacy policy. And it has its challenges, but it's just something that's been private, it's out there. I mean, I get that nobody reads them, but this sort of gets me to my second point. The concept of privacy is really more of a ritual right. It's really the opportunity to have notice. It's not that the right to be provided with right in your face notice of everything, because if you provide people with in their face notice of every single thing and you're not distinguishing between non-personally identifiable data bits and social security numbers, people will be very quickly faced with an information overload where you really need to get the important stuff kind of in their face, and then you can leave the less important stuff maybe buried into a privacy policy. But I think a lot of folks miss that it's not that there's a right for everybody to view a privacy policy. It's really the opportunity to understand, to the extent that you care about such things, you should have the opportunity to see what information is being collected on you from a consumer standpoint. You need to have some consistency here, and I wasn't really sure how to frame this in a bullet point, but let me just give you an example. If you're partnering with someone who is embedded on a website and has absolutely no control over that website and how that website is providing notice, you're sort of on a tenuous ledge when you try to make the argument that you are in fact providing notice. And there's a number of business models that are providing tremendous value, the widget model, for example. But there's a number of models that are providing tremendous amount of value by inserting themselves in one place or another on a website and then, oh, by the way, collecting data. But if you're adopting that type of a model and you can't effectively ensure that the websites that you're on are doing the right thing, I think you run into this consistency issue. And that gets me to a similar point where, to the extent that the entities who are providing notice on your behalf, whether it's you or somebody you're working with, you need to have them set up under your direct control. You can't really say, oh, well, yeah, we put it in the contract somewhere that they had to adhere to all laws, and then we kind of called it a day. Regulators are increasingly looking at, did you have the ability to ensure that your partners are doing the right thing and communicating to consumers in a way that, in providing notice to them. Now, there are some scenarios where one cannot provide direct notice, and please do not tweet that Chapell says online marketers do not need to provide notice. That's not what I'm saying, but I am saying that privacy is one of those things that there's a lot of different ways to get cut at the apple here. And so even if you cannot always provide notice, what you might be able to do is, through transparency, get at the notice issue. So just a quick for example, if you're listed on an industry opt-out page that is regularly, broadcast to consumers, you might at least have a defensible argument that you are findable. It's not a perfect argument, but it's better than nobody has any hope of finding you at all. Okay, so the second of the fair information practice principles we'll talk about is the concept of choice. So now, once you've communicated the essence of the bargain to consumers, they have a right to choose how you utilize that information. Now, generally speaking, in the U.S., that's they call opt-out choice. Other than certain situations, for example, with credit card information, generally speaking, you can do whatever in the heck you want with consumers' information until they tell you to stop, until they opt out. But there's a couple of things that companies who are innovating in this space sometimes forget about when they're thinking about opting out, or they're thinking about providing choice. You want to think about what you're enabling people to opt out from. Just a quick for example, if you're working as a if you're enabling Twitter messages to be sent, and you're also collecting data pursuant to those Twitter messages, think about what it is that what type of opt-out choice you want to offer. Are you allowing people to opt out of receiving further Twitter messages from you? Might be fine. Are you also allowing people to opt out of having data utilized for online behavioral advertising purposes? Because those are two very different things. And where I see folks in the marketplace falling down is they will say, yes, you can opt out, and we won't collect your data, and we won't do anything with it. And then it turns out, well, you're still getting tweets from the company. And that's sort of, well, I just say that's a no-no. So you need to be really clear with what you're enabling folks to opt out of. Otherwise, you run risk of getting a call from the regulators. Speaking of the regulators, there is a wrestling match going on in D.C. right now between industry and the Federal Trade Commission and some of the privacy advocates. And there was a post by a guy named Jonathan Mayer, who's a really, really bright kid from Stanford, just yesterday as part of kind of this larger discussion. And the discussion is this. Certain folks within the FTC and privacy advocacy groups believe that opt-out should mean stop collection of any data. And that's a huge issue for folks in this industry, because if you can't use data for anything, for example, ad serving optimization or fraud prevention or product development, that has a very negative impact on your ability to just run your regular business. And so what the industry has been advocating for is opt-out not of collection, but of certain uses of data. And I won't go through all of the enumerated uses. If you want more information on that, you can go take a look at the Digital Advertising Alliance code at aboutads.info. But you also want to make this opt-out choice fairly easy and effective. And I'm going to pick on the mobile space for a minute. And this speaks less to the willingness of folks in the mobile space to provide choice, and more to the difficulties in just getting mobile ads served, because there really isn't a cookie-like mechanism in mobile. But if you're requiring consumers to provide what they call their mobile unique identifier onto a website that they've never heard of and ask them to enter that in as a means of opt-out, that's a pretty high bar. I'm sort of tech savvy, and I don't know how to find my MUID on my mobile device. And so you really want to think about, are you making consumers jump through too many hoops to provide that opt-out? Because it really should be easy. And because if it isn't, you run risk of what they call a Section 5 challenge, which is the FTC's kind of broad club that says you've been unfair or deceptive to consumers. And here's I think this is obvious, but if you're not providing notice, it doesn't really matter that you're providing choice. If nobody understands what you're collecting on them, choice doesn't really matter. Again, my daughter thought this was funny. But there's some other concepts, the rest of the fair information practice principles. I just wanted to go through them really quickly. There's access. You see access being provided from BlueKai and I think Exalate and Google and Microsoft, cookie viewers. The ability to provide consumers with some transparency into the data segments being collected on them. Security, I think we all know what that means. It's a sliding scale. If you're collecting social security numbers, you damn well better really secure it. If it's non-personally identifiable data, the standard is probably not the same. And then there's enforcement. If you don't have enforcement of the first four don't really matter. Okay, so I wasn't sure what the group here wanted to talk about, so I'm going to give you two options. Maybe we just do a quick show of hands. We can talk about mobile privacy and the UDID issue, or we can talk about do not track. So quick show of hands for mobile privacy. All right, and do not track. All right, do not track it is. So we're going to go through these really quickly. Yeah, you like the snarky thing about Apple, right? And the Hamburglar. There we go. Okay, so the concept of do not track, Washington, D.C. loves their little wonderful quotes. And do not track comes initially from the head of the Federal Trade Commission back in 2010. And it's an idea that he had been floating for some time previous to that, but I think that was kind of the watershed moment. And do not track sounds like do not call, which in DC, if it sounds like something that was a good idea, well, by gum, it must be a good idea. And so the FTC has been kind of pushing for this concept for a while, and using sort of the bully pulpit instead of encouraging, because I use the air quotes for encouraging because they try to create a fiction like any of this stuff is voluntary for the industry, and that's just complete bullshit. This isn't voluntary. It's voluntary or else, which isn't really voluntary. But standards around do not track have been being developed over the last year and a half by a group called the World Wide Web Consortium. Now, the W3C has done a tremendous amount of great work over probably the last 15 years on different technical standards that help the web function. And they've been really, really effective. In the privacy realm, they've been a little less effective, and probably their claim to fame up to this point has been what they call a machine-readable privacy statement. I could talk to you about what those are, but nobody really uses them, so there's not really much point. But the W3C has amassed a pretty interesting group from industry and from the advocacy community all over the world. And so there's probably, I don't know, there's probably 30 or 40 folks on what they call a tracking protection working group creating standards for a browser-based do not track concept. So is everybody familiar with how that works? Well, here, I guess that gets to my next bullet. So the concept is really simple. The consumer goes into their browser, and Mozilla is probably the first one to offer this. I think there's a couple of others that offer it. But you go into the Chrome of your browser, and you see you get a little option that says, I do not want to be tracked by websites. Now, we're going to leave aside the issue of I don't know what in the hell it means by I don't want to be tracked. But it's a fairly simple interface that once that button is proactively clicked, then the browser sends a signal that says, do not track has been enabled. So it's super simple. Except, so what the W3C is doing is saying, OK, well now, you people out in the ecosystem, when you see that that's been turned on, here's what you have to do. And anybody who's been involved in the advertising operations or the SEM space over the last decade knows that this is not a simple thing because it's such an interdependent system with a number of folks doing a number of things, some above board, some below board. But there's a whole bunch of, it's sort of a hornet's nest of data, making it sort of difficult to come up with standards for this. But the group has made actually a fair amount of progress. The thing that's sort of interesting to me, so literally this is the composition of the group. You've got some academics, you've got some members of the Article 29 working group in Europe, which is sort of their advisory committee to the EU Commission. You've got some industry, You've got the Network Advertising Initiative. You've got the IAB and the IAB Europe participating. But a large swath of the industry is IBM, Apple. So industry is technically represented, but I'm not entirely sure that it's folks in this room whose interests are being represented. And so when I say this is probably the most important thing that very few people are paying attention to, I mean it. It's literally there is a small handful of folks who are actively working in this, myself included. I foot the $8,000 bill to join it because I thought it was sort of important to have the smaller third-party ad network platform and technology player at least somewhat represented in these discussions. Hey, how are we doing on time? 5? All right. We'll go through this pretty quickly. So it sort of depends on how this impacts you. If you would consider yourself an intermediary, if you're not Google and you're not a direct advertiser or publisher, you're probably some flavor of an intermediary, in which case this probably impacts you. If you're working in the EU, it impacts you even more. Now, we talked about proactively turning on the Do Not Track button. There are folks within the EU Commission who believe, well, this solves everything if we just have the default for Do Not Track be turned on. And then we're done. We're all set. And so if you're working in the EU, this is even more important. I keep hearing terms like big data and attribution model. Depending on how tracking is defined, attribution model goes away if Do Not Track is turned on. And that has a really profound impact on a number of people in this room. I've already talked about them. Really quickly, the Do Not Track is really all about the definitions. Clearly, Do Not Track means online behavioral advertising. It may mean analytics. There are elements in the privacy advocacy world right now that are talking about, well, even frequency capping should be turned off if Do Not Track is turned on. Now, just think about what impact that might have on people in this room's business. A lot of what the SEM folks are doing would be very negatively impacted here. By the way, remember when I was talking about how the rules are written around the intermediary and what the intermediaries must do? First parties are all but completely exempted from the Do Not Track standards. So it's great that Apple is creating standards for all of you without really any of you guys participating. But that's what's going on right now. And then there's exceptions and exemptions, and again, those tend to be tailored to what first parties, to what the first parties are doing. I'm going to jump out now because we want to take a couple of questions. If we don't, I can keep talking. Or I can bring my uke back and maybe jam out a little bit.
Hi, over here. This is Tim from Zappos. Do you have any data on how large the Do Not Track, panel, or what the percentage of traffic is for Do Not Track? And then also for first party, can technology vendors mitigate that by creating first party cookies that the brand advertiser can put on their site to drop?
Okay, so the first question around what's the ubiquity or the usage rate of Do Not Track? And right now it's really small. I think of worldwide browsers, of people who have it on, I think it's less than 1%. Don't quote me on it, but it's not enough to, it's somewhere, it's really low. The fear is, particularly in Europe, is that if the default for Do Not Track gets turned on by law there, that's potentially a problem. And even in the US, there's a little bit of a slippery slope issue where, if it's 3% now, in 10 years it's, I don't know, it's 15 or 20%, and that's, increasingly going to have a negative impact on, on your business. And then the second question was, first party. See, this is where you run into some challenges. If the intent is to jerry-rig the system and use first-party cookies for third-party purposes, I think you're going to have a problem. However, if the intent here is to work as a service provider completely under the direction of the first party with no independent usage of data on your end, then I think that's an adequate solution. Does that make sense? Oh.
Hi, George Mickey from RKG. Quick question: if you're handicapping, the likelihood of an EU-like solution of defaulting to do not track unless, I think the way it's written in the EU, unless the tracking is required to make your site function. You can use cookies to post data from one page to the next, but that's about it. What's your handicap of that sort of thing happening in the U.S., particularly given SOPA sort of going down in flames, thankfully?
Yeah, so it's another good question. I think in the U.S. it's fairly unlikely. Barring some major privacy catastrophe that, to the magnitude that I don't know that any of us can envision, I think it's unlikely that default gets turned on. Mozilla, to their credit, has been very clear that they believe that do not track is about expressed user choice, and therefore it should be defaulted off. We'll see if that type of sentiment ends up in the W3C spec. But, you know, so I think unlikely in the US, very, very unlikely. In Europe, I don't know. I mean, Europe is sort of an interesting place for a bunch of reasons, but from a privacy perspective, I mean, they've technically had an affirmative consent standard on a bunch of things over the last decade and have really inconsistently enforced it. And so when they say affirmative consent for cookies, for all cookies or all non-essential cookies, you know, they're sort of in a tenuous position. I think they're all hoping do not track becomes the panacea for all of their e-privacy issues. Whether it will be, I think, remains to be seen. But at the very least, it's 3 or 4 months from now before I think we really see anything. Ken's heading to the stage, which means I think I'm getting the hook. Do we have time for one more question, or am I done? Okay. I can talk for 30 seconds on Europe if that's of all interest to folks. No, you're all groaning.
I think, Alan, we'll leave it there then.
All right.
If anybody wants to hear more about Europe Mobile, et cetera, around privacy, Alan will be around.